Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to allow 1 minute for other folks to join us too. Hello, and welcome to today's public program, our second panel of the ReMIX History Programming accompanying the exhibition Stan Douglas, Allegories of the Present. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Fauni Ibarra, and I am the Public Programs and Residency Coordinator here at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and Stolo nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank the Canadian Heritage and North Vancouver Recreation and Culture for the support of today's events. A note before today's presentation: if you would like to see live captions displayed for today's panel, you can enable this by selecting the CC Live Transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you're experiencing any technical issues with the Zoom interface, we will also be live streaming today's event on Griffin Art Projects Facebook, so you can watch from there as well. Lastly, I'll mention that at the end of today's event, there will be a chance to ask questions using the Q&A panel box. Please feel free to post your questions throughout the event, and then we will read them. So before we begin today's talk, as part of Griffin Spotlight features, where we invite local BIPOC organizations to give a short presentation on the work that they do, we have the honor of hosting Nigra Ubenta joining us from Montreal. Nigra Ubenta develops innovative contemporary art projects based on research and the practices of Afro-descendant and African artists and curators. To present the organization's mission and vision, we have Diane Gistal. Diane, if you want to join us.
Yes, perfect. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming here today on a beautiful Sunday. Also, thank you, the Griffin Art Project and Karen Tam for inviting me. For the next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to be speaking to you about Nigra Ubenta. And also feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. I know I have a strong French accent. Sometimes it might be complicated to understand me. So do not hesitate to interrupt if you want me to repeat or if something is unclear. So let me start by saying a few words about my own background. So I'm an independent curator based in Jojage, Montreal. I'm the founder and executive director of Nigra Ubenta, the organization I'm going to talk about today. And I'm also the co-founder of Black Joy Montreal, a platform that seeks to cultivate joy and promote wellness within Black communities. So what is Nigra Ubenta? So Nigra Ubenta is a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing innovative contemporary art projects based on research and critical discourse on the practices of Afro-descendant and African artists and curators. Our vision. So we are committed to creating sustainable spaces for Black artists and cultural workers to express themselves freely. Our mission, so we aim to showcase Afro-descendant and African art, cultures, and history. We are dedicated to breaking down the barriers faced by Black artists, curators, and cultural workers in Montreal and in Quebec. We are committed to developing innovative contemporary art projects designed by individuals from Black communities. In 2021, we were the Equity Award recipient of the Conseil des Arts de Montréal, and I quote, tackling a number of ambitious projects with courage and candor, Nigra Juventus's mission is to engage and include Black people in a dialogue from which they have often been excluded, particularly in museum institutions, skillfully blending creativity and wisdom. The organization's willingness to question and act lights the way for the future. So this is a recognition we received in 2021. So in my presentation, I will focus on the three main services program we offer: exhibition, creative projects, talks and conversation. So first, exhibitions. This is a picture of the exhibition Subalterns presented in 2019. The picture you see is the work of Constance Strickland. And I don't know how you say that in English, États-Unienne, United Statesian, I guess, because I don't use the word American to talk about people from the US. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's colonial anyway. So she's an United Statesian actress, writer, producer, and director. She is best known for creating physical dance theater pieces using gestural body movement and human sound as the main vehicle to explore what it means to be human, writing with the body as the main landscape for exploring the complex realities of the lives of women. And the piece she presented in our exhibition, Dear Nina, Ever Seen a Childless Mother? It's a short film that takes an intimate approach to highlight the visual impact of mental illness in Black communities, namely where women are present. This is another exhibition, in Screaming in the Present, the Canadian component in dialogue with transnational project Shaping the Past. Screaming in the Present critically reflects on the power of commemorative communities. Artist Morija Ketenge-Benza blurs the boundaries between his story and official history, individual memory and collective memory, by questioning his presence and his inscription on the territory, and by disrupting traditional cartographies. In her installation, Karen Tam, whose research focuses on different forms of construction and representation of cultural identity, she unearthed a multitude of buried narratives revealed through relics. Despite their different background, the two artists enter into a remarkable dialogue and perform an act that is as poetic as it is political. They inscribe their past in our present, reminding us that history can also be carried by those who commemorate it. This is another exhibition, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing, an exhibition talking about the taboo of mental wellness within the Black communities. And you will see two videos of the opening of this project. So I'm sorry because I think you couldn't hear the sound with the video. Well, it's okay. Also what we do is creative projects. So I would like to talk to you about our new documentary series where we discover the practice of some Black artists. It's an intimate immersion in their work, their daily life, their home, their family. It's called Amplifier les voix des artistes noirs, Amplify Black Artists' Voices, and it will be released in 2023. And you are seeing today some footage that has never been shown before. So here is Tatiana Zinga Botao, France Patrick Henry, when we met him in the studio, visual artist Aimé Mboui at his grandfather's house. And so creative project is quite large. For example, we are right now also developing a residency program in Ghana, West Africa, for Black Canadian artists and curators, but we could also work on different type of projects. For example, I will show you a project that we did a couple of years ago in Paris, but you won't hear the sound, but you will see, you still see the images. Ah, ça marche pas. And the last part, it's the talk and panels, conversation that we have. This is a picture of Never From Here or There, rethinking the idea of home with Shana Strauss, a visual artist, Dr. Sylvia Hamilton, filmmaker, writer, and professor, and Dr. Jonah Joachim au Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal. This is another panel, the untold story, intergenerational trauma and Black women. So this conversation was exploring both visual artist Gloria Swain thesis, so the untold story, intergenerational trauma and Black women, and Dr. Myrna Lashley, decades of work in psychiatry and mental wellness. In her work, Mr. Swain employs family narrative, art making, analysis of secondary resources, and community building to address the impact of intergenerational trauma on Black women's mental health. This is another picture of a conversation we had at la Cinémathèque Québécoise. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you are a little clearer on the Nigra Juventa and what we do in Jojage, Montreal. Thank you for listening, and do feel free to contact us via social media or email if you have any question or if you want to collaborate with us. That's it.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Yan. You can follow Nigra Juventa on their Instagram and check their website. I'm gonna post it in the chat for everyone. I know Karen already posted the website, but you'll have the Instagram there as well. So yeah, thank you, Yan. And to moderate today's panel, we have Griffin Adjunct Curator, Dr. Karen Tam. I will introduce her now. So let me just remove spotlight. Perfect. So Karen Tam is a Jojage, Montreal-based artist whose research focuses on the constructions and imaginations of ethnic spaces through installations in which she recreates Chinese restaurants, karaoke lounges, opium dens, curio shops, and other sites of cultural encounters. She has exhibited her work and participated in residencies in North America, Europe, and China, including the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and the Hejianing Art Museum. She holds a PhD in Cultural Studies from Goldsmiths University of London and an MFA in Sculpture from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is represented by Gallery Hugues Charbonneau. So Karen, if you want to take it.
Thanks, Vani. And I want to thank Deanne for a wonderful presentation and sharing the work that you and Miga Juventa do. And I hope everyone will be able to collaborate with you in the future. Thank you everyone for joining us for the second panel of the ReMIX History Public Program. Today, we'll hear from 4 artists who will talk about their practices relating to history, storytelling, and archives. The conversation will also touch upon affinities between their practices with Stan Douglas's work in general and on Black diasporic visual production. Our first speaker will be Michèle Pearson Clarke from Toronto, who explores representation and social engagement through photography, film, video, and installations, and will share her work on Black and queer loss and the archiving of feelings. After, we'll be joined by Charles Campbell, speaking from Victoria, who explores Black history through his performances in sonic installations, especially through his performance character, Actor Boy, and travels in birdsong work. He'll talk about his Maroonscape project and work concerning Black breath. Our third speaker is Michaëlle Sergile from Montreal, and her use of weaving and archives in her work questioned the official historical narratives of her native Haiti as a way to rewrite histories and re-inhabit spaces. While our fourth speaker, Dawit Petros from Chicago, deals with issues of colonialism, migration, space, and architecture in his work, specifically Spazio Disponibile. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Michèle Pearson Clarke is an artist, writer, and educator who works in photography, film, video, and installation. Born in Trinidad, Clarke works on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. And this territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. She has exhibited both nationally and internationally, including in Chicago, Lagos, Los Angeles, and Montreal. Most recently, Clarke served as the second Photo Laureate for the City of Toronto from 2019 to 2022, and her work was added to the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. Clarke holds an MSW from the University of Toronto, and in 2015 received her MFA in documentary media from Toronto Metropolitan University, where she is an assistant professor in photography in the School of Image Arts. Over to you, Michèle.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for that warm welcome. Hello to my fellow panelists. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm just going to really give a brief overview of my practice, and then we can get into more conversation later on. But I always start with this slide. All of my projects focus on the interiority of Black and Black queer folks, and particularly focuses on what are considered negative affects, feelings having to do largely with grief, with yearning, with loss, and with mourning. And that's informed both, I would say, by my previous practice. Before I was an artist, I worked in health education and health promotion for about a decade, and also by my personal experience of grief following the death of my mom in 2011, which really, I would say, has been the kind of driving life experience that has sent me down this path. When I was thinking today about the topic of the panel and thinking about the archive, I would say that my practice is less about remixing history or remixing the archive, but really thinking about how do I contend with these two major archives. Because my work is about Black pain, I'm always thinking about the visuality of the images that I make. So working in photography and video, I'm contending always with the archive of representation of Blackness, particularly in photography. So we know that we have, over 175 years of negative images that have played a role in constructing how we have been taught to see Blackness in an image. And secondly, I think a lot about the archive of Black pain and suffering. So we also know that we have a long history of Black pain and suffering being made a spectacle for public consumption. And so I'm always holding these two archives in mind when I think about the contemporary images that I am making, that both are trying to grapple with the ability for Blackness to be seen in my images, given these two archives and the power that they hold on all of us in terms of how we see. And also, wanting to think about what strategies are available to me to possibly mitigate the impact of these archives on the work that I make. And I wanted to share two main sort of theorists that help shape how I think about what I'm doing in relation to these topics. And the first is this book, The Archive of Feelings by Anne Spetkovich, in which she argues, as it says here, that lesbian and gay history demands a radical archive of emotion in order to document intimacy, sexuality, love, and activism. All areas of experience that are difficult to chronicle through the materials of the traditional archive. So the archive most often tells us, what happened, when it happened, who it happened to, but how did it feel to experience what happened? So I think very much about less looking back at an archive, but that my work is very preoccupied with archiving, this early sort of 21st century queer and Black sort of umbrella or container of feelings as we grapple with, late stage capitalism, climate change, the pandemic, and so on. And also this book, if, I hope everybody out there has what this book has been for me, which is just that seminal text that unlocked a lot of ideas and continue to sort of support and frame how I think about this relationship between, as the book is titled, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness by Michèle R. Fleetwood, in which she says, as it says here, really grappling with this question of when and where is it possible to see Blackness in an image, who sees, how is seeing determined, when and where are the moments in which Blackness visually comes into being. These questions are deeply embedded in performance theory's inquiries into subjectivity, address, affect, and positionality. And so the relationship that she argues or lays out in this book has really informed my approach in terms of thinking about affect and the role of performance in communicating that in a visual image. So I'll just give an overview of the feelings that I've been archiving. This is a project from 2013, It's Good to Be Needed, where I was thinking about both, for queer women, both the failure of a relationship, a romantic relationship, but also the failure of meeting the community norm of being friends with your ex. And so I documented couples who were exes but not friends. I asked them to meet and hold hands and documented this moment of intimacy, a repeated gesture in an attempt to think about an effort to repair something. We joke about lesbian processing, but if you are queer and you're not friends with your ex, you probably have tried, you've had conversation, you've had exchanges. And I was very curious to see if a single physical gesture could do something to shift feeling as compared to conversation language. In All That's Left Unsaid, which is a single channel video that I made in 2014, here I use Audre Lorde as a surrogate and a stand-in for my mom. I was thinking about the experience of not just me grieving her for myself, but also grieving her own losses. And I use speech here to sort of reflect that dual relationship, that when somebody you love has passed on, there is their presence, their love, your relationship with them you miss, but then there's also all the things that that person gets to miss out, has to miss out on because they're no longer here. And so I thought about all the things that she would never get to share her opinion about, all the, social issues she would never get to comment on, and in turn, how I would never be able to hear her opinions, her thoughts. And similarly with Audre Lorde, as a spiritual mom, I think about also the ongoing loss of her speech as an absence. My MFA thesis, Parade of Champions, in 2015, I was interested in the intersection of Blackness, queerness, and grieving a mother. And so what you're seeing here is 3 still videos of 3 other Black and trans folks in Toronto who had lost their moms in about the same time span that I had lost my mom. And it was interesting for me to think about using this process as a way to connect with other people who were, experiencing what I was experiencing, and help me to make sense of it, but also to make space for sort of everyday grief that is absent from dominant narratives around Black queer folks. And also the narrative that, our families reject us, and that is the only possible narrative once somebody comes out. But the stories that were shared here all demonstrate, a closeness and an intimacy and a love for a mother who has passed on. Sawtooth Compositions in 2018. This is a work, a 3-channel work, as you can see, that features 17 Black Torontonians making that sound. So it's about 10 minutes long, and it is in conversation and in response to Shade Compositions by Rashad Newsom. And this work is really trying to archive the Black Canadian irritation, frustration, anger, grief, that whole host of emotions that's expressed in this oral gesture in response to the ways that our experiences are often minimized and reduced by making this comparison with the US. We often get told that anti-Black racism either doesn't happen here, or that, well, if it happens here, it's not as bad as down there. And so I put this work in conversation with Rashad's work to really think about that dynamic. The Animal Seems to Be Moving is a self-portrait project that I've been working on for the past few years. And this project is trying to archive the particular feeling of humor and absurdity, the way that we use these affects in response to oppression. I've always been read as younger than I am, and as I age, because I'm masculine, I'm finding that my body is becoming more threatening to certain people, that as I move from being read as a young Black boy to being read as a middle-aged Black man, how that is shifting responses to me very often in public space. And as I grappled with the absurdity of having to worry about more risk and less safety for myself in the world, just as I age, I was really struck by that place of, just really wanting to lean into the affect of absurdity to illustrate the perception of my body as a risk, and what that means for me as somebody who, straddles identities that intersect in terms of my Blackness, my maleness, and my queerness. And then finally, I'll end with Quantum Choir. This is the most recent work that I had on display this summer. And in this work, I use the vulnerability of learning to sing as a way to reflect on the vulnerability of being, queer and masculine and female-bodied. In the last decade, we've had several, cultural conversations about toxic masculinity, about Black male masculinity, about trans masculinity, and all of these circulating cultural conversations really impact the ways that people read queer women who are masculine. So our masculinity gets acted upon in ways that our masculinity does not act back. And so in conversation with my top participants, I wanted to find a way to invite people in to think about that vulnerability without us actually talking about it. And so as somebody who's had a lifelong shame around my singing voice, I decided to lean into that vulnerability as a way to illustrate this other vulnerability that I wanted to talk about. So what you're seeing here is a 4-channel piece that features me and 3 other queer masculine women who all felt similarly, sort of had grappled with lifelong shame about their inability to sing. We worked with a vocal coach over 3 months, and we learned to sing Queen of Denmark by John Grant, and we performed for the camera. So I'll end with a short excerpt of that.
Don't know what to want from this world. I really don't know what to want from this world. Don't know what it is you want from me. Really don't have anything from me at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michèle, for giving us an overview of your work. It's really fascinating. I can't wait to get more into it in the conversation after our next 3 speakers. So our second speaker today is Charles Campbell, who is a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and curator whose practice animates the future imaginaries possible in the wake of slavery and colonization. His artworks, which include sculptures, paintings, sonic installations, and performances, have been exhibited widely in the Americas and Europe. Recent exhibitions include Vancouver Special, Disorientations, and Echo at the Vancouver Art Gallery, Fragments of Epic Memory at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and The Other Side of Now at the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Campbell holds an MA in Fine Art from Goldsmith College and a BFA from Concordia University. He currently lives and works on unceded Lekwungen territory, Victoria, BC. Charles?
Thank you, Karen. Hello. Hi, I would just like to start by offering a libation to my ancestors. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my work, starting with a project I did called Travels in Birdsong. I'm gonna give you a minute to share my screen here. Yeah, I just wanted to start with a project called Actor Boy. Actor Boy is a project that I have been working with since about 2009, I believe. And he emerged out of a series of paintings I did on a John Canoe character in Jamaica. John Canoe is a Christmas time festival in Jamaica, and what kind of interested me about the time was that it was this sort of space of kind of momentary, although not absolute, obvious freedom for slaves in the territory. They demanded that they be allowed to celebrate at Christmas time, and though that time of celebration, there was the Festival of John Canoe where people would enact parodies of their overseers and kind of the sort of take advantage of the topsy-turvy world of carnival. And several of the kind of major slave revolts in the Caribbean took place during Christmas time. And I was sort of thinking about that energy, that the energy of that festival, and also this series of paintings by a Jamaican artist called Isaac Mendez Belisario, which documented John Canoe and which took place, or which he painted right after emancipation in Jamaica. And I really imagining this time immediately after emancipation as this time that opened up possibilities. So all of a sudden, you know, the absolute restrictions of slavery were being broken apart. And I started to imagine what that transition to this sort of moment of possibility would be like. And out of that, to develop this character of Actor Boy. And in my imagination, he is not somebody from that past moment, but rather from one of the futures that was made possible at that moment. So opening up that moment of possibility. And he sort of exists in this sort of more utopic future, or sort of more of a Black utopia, I suppose, where those possibilities have realized. And kind of what drew me to him was this idea of him coming from that sort of alternate future into our present and trying to understand how we got where we are now instead of this other place we could have arrived at. So the image you see of him here is a project I did called part of Travels in Birdsong, and here this is in Charlottetown, PEI. What I did here was create this sort of audio reconstruction of the bog. The bog was the sort of traditional Black neighborhood in Charlottetown that existed. I mean, it's one of the oldest Black communities actually in Canada at the time. It pre-existed Africville. And it was a Black and poor community. And I was trying to kind of gather the stories from this history, essentially. And the conceit of the installation was that it was really not just a sculpture, but rather this sort of technology of memory capture, that I was trying to capture the energy of this space. And then through a series of performances, I would extract those memories and then begin to speak to the memories. So this is a picture of Actor Boy speaking to the memory of the bog. And what was important to this, so I did a series of research on the bog and various incidents and so on, and then I would essentially ad lib a conversation with the characters from these stories. And importantly, really, you would only hear my series of questions and wouldn't hear the responses. And one thing that was important to me here was that the audience sort of have to take responsibility for the construction of the narrative, that they are given clues to a narrative, but they have to construct it themselves. I'm going to move on quickly to my Maroonscape projects. This is the Maroonscape 1 Cockpit Archipelago. It was done initially for the Perez Art Museum, and the kind of prompt was, what does a Caribbean future look like? And I was really drawn to this area in Jamaica called Cockpit Country. If you've ever been to Jamaica, when you or Kingston in particular, so when you fly over the island, you'll encounter these sets of conical hills, and it's a very, very unique landscape. And for me, it's sort of, when I fly over that area, it's sort of suddenly there's this sort of feeling of coming home for me. Importantly, Cockpit Country is sort of the heart of Maroon territory in Jamaica, and the Maroons were essentially escaped slaves, initially from the Spanish and later from the British, that formed communities in the hills in Jamaica, both in Cockpit Country to the west of Jamaica and also in the east, in the Blue Mountains. And they formed a resistance to slavery and British rule, and essentially fought a guerrilla war against the British and won their independence or autonomy, I should say, from the British in roughly 1838, 1840, depending on which group it was. So that's 50 years before the Haitian Revolution. There was sort of these independent Black communities. And what I tried to do here was kind of imagine that as a sort of, in a way, as an architectural model. So trying to take that and looking at the history, trying to take the histories and the stories of that place and kind of, in a way, build it as a sort of model of the future. It's called Cockpit Archipelago because it sort of also imagines sea level rise. So instead of just a group of mountains, it's now a group of islands. So there's sort of that implied threat of sea level rise. And then what was also important to me in this piece was to present also it as not as a completely intact landscape, but as a disrupted one. So it's these sort of fractures become very apparent as you investigate the landscape more closely. And also initially it looks like one contiguous set of hills. There are some of these areas that are sort of massively disjointed and obviously kind of turned around. And that was, for me, trying to get a little bit at the complexities of Maroon history. So we like to tell this sort of heroic narrative of the Maroons and their resistance to slavery, but then there were also these sort of serious compromises that they had to engage in to maintain the autonomy on an island that was absolutely built around the enslavement of Africans. The piece is accompanied by this soundtrack, which is Maroonscape 2. And what I've done here is I've taken endemic birds from cockpit country, and I've taken their trills and tweets and I've turned them into Morse code. And the Morse code essentially speaks a line from Octavia Butler, which is paradise, from Parable of the Talents, which is paradise. The child in each of us knows paradise. Paradise is home. Home as it was, or home as it should have been. Paradise is one's own place, one's own world, knowing and known, perhaps even loved and loved. Yet every child is cast from paradise into growth and destruction, into solitude and new community, into vast, ongoing change. So one of the concerns there with placing that passage on Octavia Butler was trying to sort of literalize this idea of kind of nature sending us a message. So again, we're looking at the sort of disruption of paradise. Cockpit country itself is under threat from extractivist economies, specifically the bauxite industry, and then which ties into sort of these sort of global ecological threats and this sort of absolute diminishment in the number of birds, quite literally. And I just sort of started to imagine those voices as kind of literally speaking of the threat to us. The next piece I wanted to talk about is also in the Maroonscape series. This is Maroonscape 3, Finding Accompanying. Accompanying is also a community in cockpit country, and the piece refers to a tree called the Kinder tree, which is based in Accompanying, and it is the tree essentially where the Maroons would gather to sign treaties, where the various Maroon groups would get together, and also ultimately where the treaties with the British were signed. And so I kind of envision this gathering place under the tree. But more than that, this piece really kind of took off in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, and that sort of branching form of the tree became lungs for me. So the trachea and then the branches into the bronchioles, and branching out into the lungs. So the whole piece became this monument, really a monument to Black breath for me. And I was thinking about both this sort of site of community gathering and this site of resistance within the cockpit country, and then how that related to our, basic survival and to Black breath. I mean, at the time, it was, there was this constant barrage of the term "I can't breathe," which, although Michèle spoke about this a little bit, about our, the sort of parade of Black pain that is constantly put on view, and that was just so powerfully on view for me during 2020 and the uprisings around the death of George Floyd, and so this sort of piece consolidated around this area, this idea of creating this monument to breath and this space of community gathering. It also was accompanied by an audio piece. It's a much subtler piece. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it here.
We can hear it.
So the sound essentially is the sound of breathing, and then also set within the backdrop of the rainforest in BC. So I was looking at the specific place I was on the west coast of Canada, and the sort of natural environment that I was in, as opposed to that space in Jamaica. And then the breath, if you listen closely, it's actually not natural breathing. It's they're inhalations and exhalations that essentially spell out a binary, make up a binary code. So if we look at how letters are formed in computer speak with ones and zeros, the inhalations being a 1 and the exhalations being a 0. What the breath spells out is a phrase, the breath that will be taken. And it's again an allusion to how fundamental our breath is, and also the threat that Black breath was under, and how that had come to the fore during this time in particular. As part of this piece, it really seemed necessary to create an opportunity for community gathering around the piece, and that became a piece called Black Breath Spectacle. If you might remember, several years ago, I think in 2017, there was a piece called Black Death Spectacle, put on by Parker Bright in protest, who was protesting this painting of Emmett Till by Dana Schultz at the Whitney Biennial. And this, in a way, was a kind of a response to Parker Bright's piece, and with some of the same concerns. So thinking about that fact that our death and our pain is constantly put on spectacle, but here instead I was putting our breath on display. So I worked with about 20 Black, mostly artists and curators in BC, and I did a set of recordings of breath from senior members of the Black community here, and had those recordings played out by these 20 people who roamed around the Vancouver Art Gallery. I think here Nura is taking a look at the Yoko Ono exhibition. So it was a really subtle intervention into the space. It was just a sort of audible sound of breathing that was being carried by a large contingent of Black folks in the exhibition. And then eventually we gathered around the tree and had a series of talking circles. Initially with an audience. Basically, we just did our introductions with an audience there, and then we closed the space and just had a conversation amongst ourselves, mostly about our relationship to our ancestry. And then later, this piece was the audio from that piece became part of an exhibition at the Surrey Art Gallery, which is also similarly titled Black Breath Spectacle. What you're seeing on the wall is an audio spectrograph of the audio recording of breath, and then it plays on that parabolic speaker in the center of the room where people can hear it. And yeah, it was sort of quite affecting how this audible sound of breath changes the nature of a room. I'm continuing to work on this project and creating what I'm calling a Black Breath archive. So I'm working with a bunch of young folks in Surrey initially to record the breathing from their families, from senior members of the Black community, both in Surrey and in Vancouver. And then that material will some of that material will end up in an exhibition at the Surrey Art Gallery, but I'm sort of building this regional archive of Black Breath. And I'm going to stop it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. It's lots of things to talk about later, and especially about, I guess, relating to Michèle's sort of a different kind of archive that's not, the typical institutional like physical visual archive, but archive of feelings, of experience, of the body, embodied archive. So thank you for that. I'll introduce our third speaker, who is Michaëlle Sergile, who is an independent artist and curator working mainly on archives, including text and works from the post-colonial period from 1950 to today. Her artistic work aims to understand and rewrite the history of Black communities, and more specifically of women or communities living in diverse intersections through weaving. Often perceived as a medium of craftsmanship and categorized as feminine, the artist uses the lexicon of weaving to question the relationships of gender and race. In 2022, she exhibited at the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec, the Musée d'Art de Joliette, and the Off Biennial of Dakar. She was also nominated for the Sobi National Recognition Award that same year. She lives and works in Jojega, Montreal, a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. So over to you, Michaëlle.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so yeah, my name is Michèle. I'm a textile artist. I always start my presentation when I talk about my work with one specific artwork, because that's really how I started working with textile. And so my first work was about Peau Noire Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask from Frantz Fanon. And it's a really well-known book from Frantz Fanon, and it's something that people often read during their university background. They have it in sociology, psychology, and even in arts. And it's a book that I read in 2016, and I really enjoyed the book because it was written in 1952. And it's really a book that focuses on the power dynamics between Black communities and white communities. And it's a book that by rereading it in 2016, I realized that there were some things maybe left behind when we think about this book in our current time. And as a Black woman, there was some things that kind of bothered me in my reading of this book. And it's actually the fact that Frantz Fanon, in his analysis of the power dynamics between Black communities and white communities, he also criticized Black women and creates a power dynamic between Black women and Black men. And it's something that really, well, it didn't shock me. Well, it's mostly that I wanted to speak about that. I wanted to point that out and just question the fact that even though we would have books that marked history, that we can still criticize them, not in a negative way necessarily, but to be able to see how we can advance in another discourse and make the book, question the book to see if there's another narrative that has been forgotten or that has been erased by another narratives. So with this book, I worked on it and created a textile piece, and we'll see it in the next slide, which is here. And the way I worked with that book was that, to me, textile is kind of like a book or like a text. It's something that you can see threads that are horizontal and threads that are vertical. And that's how I actually translated this book. So you can see 8 panels, if I'm not wrong, of textile, of fabrics, and each panels are actually one chapter in the book, and each line in the fabric is one sentence in the book. And to me, it was a way to visualize the book with a material, like being physical and being able to circle around it, but also to point out all the nuances that we can make in 2016, 2017, 2018, because I finished the work in 2018 officially. So how I translated was threads that were Black and white for the horizontal threads, so the threads that would really follow each sentences in the book. And I chose purposely Black and white because we often use the words Black and white to talk about Black communities and white communities, but actually we are different shades of beige and brown. But the fact that we reuse these words, which are not necessarily the skin color that we are, I found it a bit interesting and wanted to play with that lexicon. And so all the threads that are horizontal are Black and white. And I played also with the thickness of the thread. So if the thread is really thin, then me reading it at the time that I read it was, for me, for example, something that Fanon wrote that was inclusive enough to be in a thin thread. And I'm saying this because when you think about fabric, so being horizontal threads and vertical threads, when you have a thread that is horizontal and that is really thick, that is really big, it does take a lot of space and tend to cover up the threads that are vertical. And that's how I kind of engage with the fact that if the thread is really thick, then it's not an inclusive language, it's not an inclusive subject. So when the thread is really thin, then he's considering different communities. He's considering not only Black men, but Black women, or different scenarios and different narratives. So that's how I really builded this whole code to be able to weave everything. And you do see that there's kind of shades of brown and beige. So to kind of create a counter discourse on the fact that we use the words Black and white to define communities, I use for the vertical threads, so really the threads that support the whole fabric to create this fabric, were shades of brown and beige. So it was a way to also create an intersection between the text and between realities. And you can see sometimes really, I don't know if you can see my mouse on top of it. I don't think so. Well, there's really like bits of white that you can see sometimes. And it's all the time that, every time that he says that he writes the word white, I would add just a thick white thread. And every time that he would talk about a Black woman or name a Black woman, I would add like a thin black thread, but with a bow. So that way you could still see how many times he actually talk about Black women and how many times there's actually a discourse that is inclusive or a discourse that is not a negative critique on Black women. So my work is mostly focused on creating responses to, so in this case, it was a responses to Fanon and to unique narrative. I say in Canadian education because we do see these types of reading, like this book. I know that I've tackled it during one of my art history classes, but we never really questioned what Fanon was saying in his book, but just stating the fact that it's a critical book and that it's a book that we need to read. So other than that, I felt like we needed to also be able to critique it and to be able to see that this is one narrative and we have to be able to reread it in different times. And yeah, also binarity of words, because the book is, as I mentioned before, is really not inclusive, and generic words to this idea of saying community, but it's actually communities in plural. I'm going to focus now mostly on my new work. I think for the first work that I've talked about, that's really when I started working with textile, but now I'm trying to see how textile can be a medium not necessarily always associated to text, but still associated to archives. And that's when I started working on Union United Church. And it's also, well, I've worked with Diane, that was the first presenter at Migra Juventa. And it's actually when we were working together that I realized that there was not a lot of artists who worked on the history of Black communities in Montreal. And that's when I started questioning myself into, okay, well, is there anything that I can say as an artist? Because we do have a possibility to show work, to show stories, to show different narratives to a wider public. And I thought that it would be interesting to dig it a bit more into the archives of Black communities in Montreal. And that's when I really encountered Union United Church. And so this image is actually the first image that I've worked with. And it's the courtesy of Nancy Oliver Mackenzie, which is like a mentor to me. She has been the first contact of the Union United Church. And we've been discussing and seeing each other and working together for the past year and a half now. And she introduced me this image that is really powerful to me, because when she talked about this image, it was mostly just to say that, oh yeah, she found this image and there's 78 children. They were all part of the Sunday school, but she had, with 3 other members of the church, she had to create like a grid and had add numbers to each of these 78 children to be able to have their names and know who they are. And that was the really interesting part to me. And I kept saying to her, it's really important. We need to make this visible. We need to make this accessible, because just this idea of asking anyone in the church who would come to the church to identify these children is also a community work. It's also thinking about the fact that all the people that are still at this church, that is still contributing to this church, is grandchildren or cousins or relatives of all these people who, some of them are not even are not alive anymore. So how can we make sure that history is not completely erased? Is by actually asking the community around us and asking people to be able to tell their stories, and just see how we can think about this story and how we can tell the story in the end. I just wanted to also do like a little blurb on the Union United Church, because I realized that there's not a lot of people who do know about this church. It was founded in 1907. It was a group of railway porters and their wives, which were the founding members of the Colored Women's Club. I will talk about that a bit later, convening a meeting. These men and women wish to worship in their own church, in their own style, with dignity, respect of person, and equality of participation, regardless of gender, one's ethnic origin, or faith. On August 29, 1907, they established a covenant, I can't say that word, by which the church would exist as a distinct body and which every member accepted. On September 1st, 1907, a group of 26 people worshiped together for the first time as Union Congregational Church. The first pastor called to this Black institution was Reverend F.E. Browser. Union Congregational Church was founded as a religious institution with a strong faith and spiritual base that was to become a center of community activism. So I've worked with the image that I first shown you of the 78 children, and I've been weaving this image with a loom that we call the jacquard loom. So it's part digital and part manual. I started my weaving completely manual. So the first work that I've presented, which was Black Skin, White Mask, it was completely manual. And it was really following each sentences of a book. And now I'm really focusing on how I can build an image through weaving, but be also able to have it in a space that is close to, we say in French, grandeur nature, which is close to having every person in this image as tall as another child. So I was thinking about creating more work that would be still woven, but of images themselves, and add some references afterwards on the image instead of necessarily always focusing on text. Also, while I was looking at Stan Douglas's work, I've seen some links in his work and my work, which is this idea of reenactment, or to reimagine position on change and bridge between past and present. I will talk about that work a bit later, but I felt like there was a connection in this idea of being able to talk about an event or talk about communities, talk about a specific thing that happened in the past, and be able to reimagine it and to see all the narratives or all the side of the story that we haven't been able to see because there was a central discourse that everyone focused on. So that's also something that I saw, power dynamics behind images, how we can create an impact of cultural memory with images. And I'm quoting Michèle Sim, which she did a really beautiful presentation on Stan Douglas's work. And that's where I've been able to see some similarities between our works. And this is one of the work that I actually really appreciated, but I'll be able to talk about it a bit later. It was a work called Penn Station, and it's the June 20th that was reimagined in 3 different times. And it's something that I really enjoyed seeing because I'm actually working with the children that I just shown. They were all sitting in one spot, a specific spot at the church, which has changed completely. And I'm working on having a really big photograph sitting next to the woven image, which will see the difference between the image from 1941, so the image that I've worked with, and the image that I took with my camera of the same spot now in 2022. And we can see the difference in terms of architecture. We can see the difference in terms of reparation. We can see how everything has been either like walls have been built and painting has been, now we have new fresh painting on top of everything, and the wood is different. So you can see sometimes small details or even sometimes things that are really different, but it's just to be able to see the same image without the children in 2 different times, and how it actually commence à évoluer, how it changed with time. And my other work that is also connected to the Union United Church is on the Women's Colored Club. So as I mentioned before that the Women Colored Club were part of the founding members of the Union United Church, and they were a collective of women. And I discovered recently that they were the first collective of women that has been ever created in Montreal. So they were the first collective of women, and they happen to be all Black women. So I was really proud to see that I was able to find even these archives at the Union United Church, and the group was founded in 1902. I do not have a lot of information on each of them, and even working with Nancy, we're kind of digging into family trees, trying to figure out how everyone is connected to the church. And it's kind of difficult to be able to have all the information on each member, but I'm still really interested into making sure that this collective is, well, we know more about them and it's somewhere that people can learn about them. So I've been weaving all the members of the collective. I'm just gonna go back. There are actually 9 women. So I'm planning on weaving all the 9 women together and create links between each of them. And this idea of creating links into an installation that would be circular is really to not create a power dynamic and not to add not thinking about someone being president or vice president or etc. I know I do have the roles under each names, but I don't know exactly how everything worked during that time. I don't know exactly how long each of them stayed in their position, if things changed. So this idea of connecting them together and creating a circular installation is really to counter this idea of power dynamic and just creating a space where we would see 9 women all connected together who built something that was meaningful in 1902 and who helped creating the Union United Church. So that's the 2 first ones that I've been doing. It's a really long process because it takes quite a while just to weave one piece. I really wanted to talk about it today because I felt like it was something that is constantly in my mind, and it's something that I really want to make sure that we will not forget. And I'm just really grateful that I have been able to work with Nancy Oliver Mackenzie with all these archives and to be able to weave these archives and to eventually, I hope, be in contact with some members of these different families and communities to be able to tackle into more information. Yep. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michèle. That was wonderful to see what you're working on right now, and I can't wait to talk to you more further after our last presenter, who is Dawit Petros, a visual artist, researcher, and educator whose work is informed by studies of global modernisms, theories of diaspora, and post-colonial studies, drawn from his formative years in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Petros installs photographs, moving images, sculptural objects, and sound work according to performative, painterly, or site-responsive logics. He completed the Whitney Independent Study Program, MFA in Visual Art from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University, a BFA in Photography from Concordia University, and a BA in History from the University of Saskatchewan. Petros has exhibited internationally, and his works have been recognized with numerous awards, including Canada Council for the Arts Production Grants and artist residencies at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Petros is also an associate professor in the Department of Photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He lives in Chicago on the unceded lands of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, an area also historically inhabited and traveled by the Ho-Chunk, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, Menominee, Meskwaki, Miamia, Peoria, and Sac and Fox. He is represented by Tiwani Contemporary in London, UK, and Bradley Ertaskiran in Montreal. Over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I am also really pleased to join my fellow panelists. Bear with me for just a moment. While I share my screen, I'm just going to let everybody know that my Wi-Fi is acting up. So I will do my best to just sort of to keep this thing forward. Okay, so So the project I'm going to talk about today is called Spazio Disponibile. So between 2014 and 2015, I was working in Italian archives, searching for materials related to the presence of an Abyssinian scholar, Abyssinia, what is now present-day Ethiopia, who lived in Italy between 1890 and 1895. And I didn't find any materials about him, but what I kept coming across were evocations of gaps in historical records. And I encountered the word Spazio Disponibile, which means available space in Italian. And they were on the pages of a historical publication, which is called Revista Coloniale, which literally translates to colonial journal. And so Spazio Disponibile became both a title for the project that I'm going to discuss today, as well as the logic with which to interrogate ideas concerning the availability of space within colonies, and specifically within African colonies. And so the project moves between pasts and presents and occupies works that range from screen prints, sound, sculpture, film, and photography. There are a number of questions that guide the research for the project, 4 key ones that I would like to share. The first one is, what are the claims that can be made in direct historical documents or texts versus the claims that we can make through our artwork? A second question for me is, in what ways can the authority of historical materials be used while simultaneously interrogating this authority? And then the third is a concern that I'm also hearing really sort of powerfully in the presentations of my fellow panelists is, how can one redirect attention from the hypervisibility of racialized African bodies while addressing the forces that have produced these subjectivities in the first place? And finally, a key concern for me is how I can expand lesser known narratives of colonization beyond the Black Atlantic to encompass waterways that include the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and in the Indian Ocean. So there are 2 triangulated vectors in the projects that there are 2 triangulated vectors in the project that support each other. And the first is a geographical one. And so the movement of Italian settlers to various to the colonial empire, Italian historical immigration of Italians to Canada and North America, and finally the contemporary migration to Italy from Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. So that's the first vector. And the second vector is the objects that reflect the making of colonial knowledge and which provide the language for the project that I'm going to share with you today. And it's architecture, infrastructure, and publications. And in my project, and it's important to state, when I say publications, I'm talking both about journals and photographs. So I will begin with infrastructure, and this is a multi-panel work that is called Spectre Teleferica, in which we see this networked landscape of colonial Eritrea, which is made visible through these inverted images of a cableway system, which was built in roughly 1935-36 to link the port of Massawa in the Red Sea to the capital city of Asmara, over the terrain that you see in the background, the difficult terrain of the Rift Valley. And it was this incredible engineering feat that was constructed to build move huge quantities of material, food, arms, and other necessities with which the colony was established. And for me, it became this interesting case study for what and how to remember and to look at in terms of this intertwined relationship that exists between modernity and colonization. And it's important to note that there's absolutely nothing in the physical landscape which, with the formation of a couple of the concrete panels that held up these metal lattice works. So this really is a specter whose presence looms via a strong absence. So the work is comprised of 4 panels, and I'll just move back here so you can see. So there's a triptych of images which occupy the 3 panels on the left. And what you see in these is an outline of the cable car, which has been etched onto dark plexiglass, and this is then overlaid on images of the Rift Valley. And the 4th panel that you see on the right here is just a black expanse which contains no permanent image. And to make this work, I extracted elements of the structure from probably 40 or 50 different photographs. And then collaged a totality which doesn't exist in any of the source images. And so this was a way for me to get to a quote, a truth effect of an image, but through a fictional means. And the etching is an engraving which is produced by a CNC machine, which results in an image that is, it's haunting, it's quivering, and it looks more like a drawing or a painting than it does the original photographic sources. I'm just going to show you this in the next slide where it's more visible. So what you see here is an aesthetic language that on the one hand wants to evoke an imperious scale of the power of the structure, but wants to do so in a very ambiguous and ambivalent manner. And so what you have is this etching which sits underneath the support of the image of the plexiglass, and it both is the support for the image and the protective layer for the image and the photographs that are below it. And this ambivalence that I speak of, I've had to produce the etching in reverse, like looking in a mirror, so that it only appears legible once it's seen from the front through its transparent surface. And I'm drawing on the metaphorical richness of the mirror, the reflective properties of the dark surface, in order to do a couple of things. One is I want to delay a spectator's capacity to quickly read the image. And secondly, I'm also trying to situate the viewer in the histories and the cartographies that the work reference, while making them astutely, while making the spectator aware of their own act of looking. This is a 2-channel film installation called All at One Point, Study 1, and it takes a community center in Montreal called the Casa d'Italia as its primary subject matter. And the Casa d'Italia was a community center built in 1936 by the Italian community. And in this work, what you see is a restless camera which moves from the exterior of the building into the interior in a sequence of linked tracking shots. And what you begin to see are a whole bunch of details that highlight how architecture functions as a microcosm with which questions of nation building, aspirations of a community can take shape. And so what the camera reveals are fasces, symbols of fascism on the building's exterior, displays of Italian memorabilia that are on the inside, as well as a large marble stylized fascist sun that is in the floor of the main rotunda. Orality, the voice, is an important repository of knowledge and archival knowledge that I'm interested in drawing from, and it's essential to the larger project. And what unfolds in the film is a voiceover in Italian, which interrogates the building and how it offers built evidence for traces of the fascist building language, which I just articulated, and specifically how the language of the building addresses legacies of Italy's immigration and colonialism to the Horn of Africa. And the voice that one hears is a gentleman by the name of Dawit Petros, who's a surveyor in Asmara. and he analyzes the syntax of the building in Montreal by extracting it out of Montreal and sort of looking at it and comparing it in relationship to buildings in Asmara, to the capital city of Eritrea. And it isn't until the very last frame of the film that we learn that Dawit Petros, the subject providing the narration, is actually a subject of the former empire. And so I just want to play you 1 minute of the film to give you a sense of how sound works.
Quando sono andati in Italia c'è un altro fattore, che si sono totalmente dimenticati dell'Eritrea, totalmente. Avevo la nostalgia, pensavo all'Eritrea, ma avevano perso le speranze e avevano totalmente abbandonato l'idea dell'Eritrea, totalmente. Osservando questa costruzione,
so we move from architecture, and I want to present two more works which look at two works which use publications. And so this is a suite of screen prints that engage colonial journals, and this is specifically a colonial journal that was authored by an Italian government official in 1908. And from left to right, La missione coloniale del popolo italiano, the colonial mission of the Italian people. In the middle, Dal Africa all'America, from Africa to America. And on the right, Dal America all'Africa, from America to Africa. And what was important for me in this work was to highlight the ways in which the Italian territories in the Horn of Africa and North America were constituted to be an outlet for these large numbers of Italians who were migrating to North America, to places like Canada. And so what I've done with the work is recalibrated the language so that I can begin to get to hidden suppositions that are outside of common knowledge. Here, La missione coloniale del popolo italiano, this pointing towards how for the Italian colonial project, both communities such as those in Montreal or in Toronto and the Italian colonies in places like Eritrea and Libya were both called colonies. And I'm interested in this work in pointing to these types of rhetorical strategies with which the violence of the colonial project in North and East Africa can be rendered less problematic when compared to the benign nature of the colonies in North America. And then in these two pieces here, where I'm taking and literally recalibrating the titles so that Dal America al-Africa, which refers to the movement of Italians from Americas here, meaning North America, to Africa, is recalibrated to create Dal Africa al-America. So a way of expanding the idea that the movement of Italians across the Atlantic to North America is sufficiently articulated in these kinds of narratives. And the last piece that I want to show you is these kinds of interrogations of photographic journals. And here, this is a work called A Constant Retelling of the History, A Constant Retelling of the Future in A Constant Retelling of the Future in the Past, Part 1 and Part 2. So as I mentioned a moment ago, so Italy is peculiar in that it's both a participant in the brutal process of empire building and a sending nation for one of the largest migrations in modern history. And so what I wanted to do here was to work with archival photographs in order to meditate on the complex role that photography plays in the articulation of this type of a contradictory nature. And so in part 2 from 2021, we see images that depict various scenes, Italians living in under various challenging circumstances in Italy, and then their movement to North America and their incorporation into various North American communities, with a highlight in Montreal and Toronto. And in the lower panel, what we see are images which reflect on the labor, the essential labor that Italian communities provided in the building of Canada at the turn of the 20th century. And this, in many ways, is a project. The building of the Canadian nation state is a project that is coterminous with the building of the Eritrean Empire in East Africa. And so this is a constant retelling of the future and the past, part 1. And what we see here is that contradictory nature of Italian colonialism, as I referred to. Here, we see Italians occupying the position of colonizers within the context of East Africa. And again, we see the labor that is producing this modernist, this contemporary modern nation state, but now with the roles reversed, and the indigenous Eritrean, Libyan, Ethiopian, Somali as the subject on which a dynamic of power is being exerted. And the construction of the work is done in quite simple strategies, extracting elements from photographs, taking them out of the compositions, positioning single photographs in relationships to other ones, inserting these abstracted black bands that you see. And the accumulation of this gesture attempts to draw focus and attention to the original role of these photographs historically, but also to the excesses of the image, which allow a subject like me, for whom these images were never intended in the present, to recalibrate them and assess their possibility to articulate a different set of meanings. And so the project is really invested in interrogating a number of messy entanglements and national formations that begin in Italy, that go to North and East Africa, and ripple across the Atlantic to Canada, but also, as I indicated earlier, incorporate the waters of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And as a larger artistic inquiry, what the project is attempting to do is to consider what it means for artists to create and occupy empty spaces, not so that we fill these empty spaces, but that we offer these spaces as moments of pause in which the paradigm of how archives are constructed through the logic of the colonies that shape them. So I will stop sharing my images there, Karen.
Sure. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for giving us in-depth view of your work, and it was great to hear, because I saw you and I saw your show last week, so so it's great to hear some of the thoughts behind particular works. I'm going to invite all of the panelists to turn on their video, and we're going to start off sort of the conversation, sort of a round table between you all. And maybe I'll just start off with just one question, and then just see how things go. And I know that Michèle had a question for the other panelists. So my first question is, to various degrees, your practices address community through storytelling. Could you elaborate on why the human connection is important in your work, and you've already all spoken about this a bit, and the ways that you involve community, whether at the research, development, the making of presentation phases?
Sure, I can start. I think very much, before I became an artist, as I said, I worked in health education. I come from a community engagement background. And so the way that I've worked with community throughout my career is something that's extended into my practice. And even though I don't work anymore, in a therapeutic role, I think the framework for working with communities in that way has shaped the way that I work with communities as an artist. And I think all of my work is autoethnographic, whether I actually appear in the work or not. But the strategy that I have been drawn to is to sort of make autoethnographic work with community, so that it's my experience, but because it's the experiences that I have that are shaped by the identities that I have, they're not unique experiences to me. It has proved to be more generative for me to sort of, reach out to community and say, I feel this thing, I experience this thing, and I'm looking for people who share that feeling or experience. And so collectively, we're going to work together to archive that feeling. And I would say too, I think it took me a while to realize that I think it's also strategic in the sense that we know very often when an individual says something that produces discomfort, that can be treated like you would be addressing something systemic, and the response might be, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. So very often when we are, articulating or pushing back or questioning larger macro systemic issues, it gets dismissed as an individual, particularly when you're talking about grief, anger, frustration, anything that's going to rock the boat. And so it has allowed me to sort of say, well, it's not just I who feel this way, it's not just an individual feeling, it is a collective feeling.
I'll maybe add something to that. I think one of the ways I approach community is, first of all, not assuming I know what it is or that it's there, and trying to create a kind of a space for community formation in the work. And often that's within the process of the practice rather than necessarily the outcome. So like, and I think that's a little bit particular to where I am as well. Like as I think, as Michèle was saying, that there's not a community, there's communities. So on the West Coast, a lot there, I wouldn't say there is a sense of a cohesive Black community. Here there are a number of different communities that locate themselves, usually in relationship to the geographies they came from, sometimes in terms of the activities they participate in, and so on. So when I'm kind of constructing a project that engages the community, I have to think through, okay, who am I inviting into the room, and how can I kind of cultivate a sense of community among that and help kind of formulate a community. So, even within the artistic community of the Black artistic community, we don't necessarily know each other until actually quite recently we've started to more consciously and actively get together. And so I look at community formation as a kind of intentional act, and as something kind of necessary within the process, that I'm kind of using the excuse of art really to sometimes form communities. Sometimes they're actually it's about getting together with friends. Sometimes it's about kind of creating the social context that can hold these discussions and also create a language for us to continue to articulate where we are and who we are. And that sometimes filters directly into the work. It doesn't always filter directly into the work.
I'm just gonna add, I feel like I've talked about it quite a lot already, but my relationship with community, I feel like I can explain it into 3 phases. One being before the work is created, during the work, and after the work. And I kind of talked about the before and during, in the sense that I'm working with a person who really helps me right now with the archives at the Union United Church, and the fact that the stories that she's telling me are also the stories that I'll be able to tell to other people, and hopefully making sure that none of these conversations are forgotten. And there's also the idea of the afterwards, and who will be able to see, to experience an artwork. And it's something that I've also been working on past works, and to if I do add text to my work, is it going to be in French, in English, in Creole? And if it is in Creole, do I add a version of it that is translated? And often I actually never did. And I think it's important not to translate sometimes work, and to making sure that, yes, the general public will have access to it, but there's some parts of the work that will be understood by only your communities. And there's some things that can be, you can create connections with your communities, and narratives and stories that you know that your community will be able to relate to. And that's something that is really important to me, in the connection that you create with different communities as well.
Yeah, Karen, I really don't know if I have any more to add. There are again, to reiterate what you acknowledged, Charles, and and Michèle's sort of comments, that I work in proximity to various communities, and they all offer a range of essential elements to the work that I do. There are the communities in Italy that I've been working with since 2014, 2015, that I whose ongoing sort of friendships continue to be an integral part of the work that now sort of continues, as you may have seen in the show, Karen. Some of the friends who are now in Montreal. So there's that kind of there's that kind of engagement, but there are also the various sort of artistic and intellectual communities that I operate within, that are really, really important to helping me sort of better understand the complexities of some of the questions that I'm dealing with in these histories that I didn't learn in my community sort of growing up. There was one narrative of the totality of the Eritrea-Ethiopia sort of conflict that was the significant sort of element by which we understood colonialism. And so I've had to step outside of my own community in order to have a different understanding and proximity to the questions that I'm dealing in the work that I'm doing now. So yeah.
Thank you. Michèle, I was wondering if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, while I was looking at all of your work and making connections with also Stan Douglas's work, I really thought about reenactment and the idea of thinking about history. And obviously, to me, artists often trying to create a response to something, but I feel like in all of your practices, there's this idea of reenactment, of reimagining or performing an act or something that we can imagine, but we haven't had the chance to necessarily see sometimes. And I even think about your work, Michèle, because in my work, I often go really far in like the 1907 and things like that. But even something that happened 2 years ago, something that is really close to us, and a memory of someone, and being able to reenact the feeling that we had or the feeling that we remember. And I feel like it's something interesting. And I don't know if any of you want to talk about this idea of reenactment into your practices, but that was my kind of question.
I'm happy to respond to that question. I think that this notion of reenactment for me is a really, really important is an important framing device, and specifically in relationship to, I think, to the affinity that I see with Stan's work, is to think about how I think specifically of two works of Stan's that have been really, really important to me. One is Overture and the other is Nutka, and the way in which historical time and multiplicities of contexts are layered over top of one another in order to produce this speculative space, which offers, which offers something else in that act of reimagination. Because I initially, one of the questions that I asked at the beginning when I was considering is, what are the claims that I can make with an artwork that I cannot make, right? The distance between the historical claim that, the distance between a historical document versus an artwork. And part of that for me is the capacity to imagine the gaps and the excesses that are in the historical document that can allow, right, that can allow a layering that points to something that is tangible, that is concrete, that is historical, but also presupposes the possibility of something else. And I think, and the other thing that enables is a space in which my own sort of certainty gets held into suspension, right? And so it's using the material, proposing something else, but also recognizing that just as the ideological nature of the materials that I'm working with are to be critiqued, that the position that I'm also using and articulating from also is being critiqued. And I think that this reimagination is an important way for me to try to deal with that.
And I would say for me, reenactment is a strategy that, as a consumer of art, it's been compelling to me for a long time. And I think about the scale and scope of what we see in Stan's work. And, that has been beyond my capacities to date. But I think at the heart of what he does, what Dawit, what you all do, and what is compelling to me is repetition. So reenactment is a form of repetition, and you can see in, Saktit, in All That's Left Unsaid, in Quantum Choir, the ways that I use repetition in sound, in image. So I'm very interested in what gets produced. Dawit just said the gaps and the excesses of a document, and I think about the gaps and excesses that are produced in performance, but particularly produced in repetition between this version, between this move and when I repeat that move, what gets produced there, and particularly with sound, my work tends to either be full of language or absent of language. And in the absence of language, that repetition of sound, what gets communicated there? So I'm really interested in the affective dimension and quality of reenactment and repetition. And, in terms of future work, see myself pushing more in that direction more explicitly as well.
Yeah, I think what also resonates with me really strongly with what Dawit and Michèle have been talking about is that absence, that idea of the absence and the gap. And when I look back on my history and the massive disruptions in cultural history that have taken place, and that seems to create the demand to enact something, to recreate a kind of sense of continuity, or to act and see if you can find the sense of continuity. I would say even more than trying to create it. So it's it's often the enactment is retrospectively a reenactment, because I'm acting and then I'm trying to see if there's like that link back to a repetition, even when I'm basing it in a historical as some sort of historical fact or something, or knowledge, there is this sort of process of fictionalization that I go through, and then it's sort of, okay, where has that taken me? It's like, is it an enactment? Is it a reenactment? What, or a reconstruction? How am I sort of rebuilding this? There's sort of a sense of kind of cultural connection, which is very much, I acknowledge, I can't actually fully attain.
I'm wondering if I guess you're saying in the reenactments, especially I guess for you, Charles, like the reenactment with Actor Boy, the reenactments are, I guess you already mentioned it and said that they're kind of reenactments of the future as well as the past.
Yeah, so yeah, he's acting through a future which implies a sort of continuity with the past, but then the more I kind of relate to it is the more like that disjunction between this actor boy whose past we don't know, in a way. He sort of has a change. We can see the point he's from in the past, and we can see kind of him as a manifestation from another future. That's also kind of the position I'm in, because I can look at my past, but then there's sort of these massive disruptions in cultural continuity that mean to act is a kind of act of invention.
And I wanted to ask Michèle for you when I guess maybe for all of you too, the use of sound in your work, right? Whether it's like Charles for the bird songs, or Michèle the voice, the choir, or and I think with Dawit too, the sound piece that you had, would you consider these in a way sort of like archival works, or like embodied archives of, not just the present, but also of the future?
I think for me, particularly, I would have to say with Suck Teeth, when I was 19 when I left Trinidad, and when I went to Johannesburg, it was my first time, in that part of the continent, and it was for a conference, and I ran into actually Rashad at the airport, and he said, sister, we are home, and that's not my relationship, to that part of the world, but at the same time, while I was there was so much that felt familiar, and one of the really biggest dimension of that was speech, was sound. And this sound, this sucking of teeth is something that we know, the things that were brought with us, and the things that, you could look at certain dishes and see, well, the origins were here, but this ingredient wasn't available, that ingredient wasn't available. It's slightly different over 500 years, but this sound hasn't changed, So it's one of the few things, particularly located in this country that, we call Canada. We know that nowhere is Blackness a monolith, but particularly I find living in a place where the multiplicity of Blacknesses that shapes the experience of living here is even more complex than in other places, but so many of us make that sound. And so I see, particularly in that sound and in that gesture, an archive that really does very viscerally connect all of us, backwards and forwards. And, that dimension of Black grief and Black anger also is something that reaches back and we know continues forward. And so that piece in particular, I think, expresses, what you're asking about there.
Yeah, I would say I don't think I've been thinking of them as explicit archive, except with the sort of new piece that I'm working on, which is very much built around this idea of an embodied archive. But it's sort of, I find it what I'm focusing on in a way is like the way they kind of the sound moves across time as well. Those sound of the birds, they're also the sounds of my childhood in Jamaica in many respects. There's this sort of way that sound has a continuity and a timelessness that holds me, and also that really it's how sound inhabits a space is also something that really interests me and sort of changes the whole dynamic of a space. All of a sudden, this, whatever in a way very sterile landscape that I'm building is suddenly an inhabited landscape instead, and it's how that change occurs. And yeah, I think even with the more recent focus on the sort of building of this Black Breath archive, it's kind of, in a way, a bit of an absurd endeavor. Because it's an archive, but and it contains so much experience and knowledge, but it's also so inaccessible. It's kind of built on inaccessibility, and then it's built around this idea of visibility of Blackness, but which is completely absent in the actual recording. You can't hear a breath as Black, like it's even though a breath, we can say a breath contains all of our experience. So it's, in a way, I see it as kind of more of a critique of the archive. I'm using the term archive, but it really points to what the archive can't capture, and this knowledge that is actually embedded and embodied, but is also in a way not accessible. So.
I love that notion, Charles. I think that is so, that's so lovely. Because I think an important part of what I'm hoping to do, I think, is constructing a dissonant archive, and insisting on the one hand on operating within those institutional contexts, the dusty, right, the cliche notion of the archive, the dusty archive, the shelves and all of this sort of physical material, but also positioning within it the residue of the body, the voice. What you hear in the film, that haunting sort of sound at the beginning, is a slowed down, a person whistling this traditional song. So these sorts of things that are recontextualized, resituated in proximity to these kinds of physical materials. And so voice, sound, the body, the moving body, architecture, these things for me are all, as you've said, a critique of the archive. But part of my insistence on occupying that space of institutional archives is because I think within the diaspora, we reside and occupy spaces in which certain types of historical claims and redresses are made through those institutional archives. And so I think on the one hand, without falling into the fallacy of these institutional archives being the only way in which certain redresses can be made, recognizing their power, but also saying that there's space within them, that part of the critique is expanding the space so that it begins to be inclusive of these repositories of information that don't have that tactility. So this expanding the embodied archive to include the body, I think is an important part of it.
I'm just gonna invite the audience to just, if you have questions for our panelists, just to type it in the Q&A chat box below. We'll take another 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. But I'm sorry for the interruption for that. But I was wondering if any of the other panelists had questions for each other because I don't want to hog out the questions.
I think the one question that I would throw out while we're waiting for the audience to throw out a question is, I think one of the things that I'm so compelled by, especially Michèle, when you showed, that sort of those two images, the dominant images of that emerged from the American experience of Blackness, right? The Renti slavery, the Renti archive, daguerreotypes that Agassi had made, as well as the Rodney King beating. So I think the one question that I have for all of you all, because I'm working so prevalently within the context of the United States, is how do you negotiate, or do you think about sort of the specificity of the Canadian dimension in relationship to these archival materials and histories that you're working with? The way in which I think things get subsumed into sort of the power of American sort of histories and experiences of Blackness.
I think about it all the time. It's an ongoing journey for me. I came here when I was 19. I have had to come to understand myself as capital B Black in the North American context. And that's an ongoing process. I don't have, I come from a Black majority country. I come from, with its own colonial history and its own, complications. But I have found that so much of what shapes the audiences I'm thinking about, or the audiences I am predominantly, sort of showing my work to, their understanding of Blackness is shaped by that American archive. So that's the archive that I contend with the most, but also have, welcomed, the work of Camille Turner, right? The work of Deanna Bowen, the work of uncovering this Canadian archive that shapes how I think about what I'm doing, but it's not the imagery that people are familiar with. It's not the imagery that shaped their understanding. It's not the imagery that has circulated globally, over the last, 6-7 decades. Yeah. And in fact, the origin of Sakti too was really sitting in a cinema waiting for a movie to start, and the Toronto Life issue with Desmond Cole on the cover, where he talks the stories about him being stalked and carded over 50 times. And these two middle-aged white women sitting behind me sort of saying, like, the shock, can you believe it, right? Like, can you believe it? And I just thought how this, always shock, always surprise, right? Like, it's always this kind of news, like it's just this new thing. And so, it's a good question to think about. What are the contemporary images that are shaping, and even, Charles talked about 2020 and George Floyd, and it's the dominance is real, right?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that it is the dominant narrative, and it's to a certain extent relevant. Like there is an echo of how systemic racism works within both of those contexts, and there is a sort of a way that Canadian racism bleeds over. And intermingles with a sort of American, with a United States of America kind of context. But I've always found it very challenging to for a long time I positioned myself really much more as Caribbean, although I recognized my identity as within how I was viewed within Canadian society as being Black, but my cultural identity was much more about my relationship with Jamaica. And it's been a process of actually understanding the multiple colonial ties between the two spaces that has actually started to knit those things together for me. Like, even just I've been doing research on the West Coast, and so the Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Victoria was was Guyanese, born of a, you know, black and white intermingling in Guyana, and so on and so forth. And even if you go like investigate that further, you find that there are sort of so many kind of iterations of that. There's this continuity of colonization between the Caribbean space where and then moving into the North American space, but you have to search for it and you have to work to get there. And I find that there's a sort of this constant push within Canada to kind of reject that dialogue, to not see it as the pertinent dialogue, either because of the dialogue from the United States is so dominant that everything becomes a binary in comparison, you know, or just because of an ignorance and a lack of desire to investigate the kind of complexities of race within the Canadian context.
Yeah, the last sentence, I was shaking my head, approving everything. But yeah, I really agree. I think it's a desire of not seeing things also, because that's actually, I started working, as I mentioned before, on archives from Black communities in Montreal, because I figured, okay, well, they existed, we have history, we have things that we need to say, but where are they? And then I realized that they are all connected, they are all part of, there's also this kind of weird dynamic between Anglophones and Francophones in Montreal, Quebec, honestly. And I feel like in the Francophone communities, it's always, we don't have information, or the information is not translated, so we don't have this information, or we don't know about this. And I feel like it's easy to have this big discourse, or all the things that happen in the US and that comes in here and that are translated and that we see in the news. And it acts as like it builds up a collective imaginary where people tend to see the US as being extremely bad and see Canada as being this great country where there's nothing to critique. And I see that in the Anglophone communities, there's this awareness that is a bit more present because the archives are in English. And I don't know why there's always this excuse of not being able to know things about Canada because, or Quebec or Montreal, because things are not translated or not accessible. And it's actually something that I'm really working on right now, and to be able to, all the archives that I'm working on with Nancy will be translated. And I'm kind of sick of this really lame excuse of not knowing because things are not accessible. It's a barrier of language. It's not a real barrier. Language is not a real barrier to me. There's always someone to be able to help translating things and to be able to make sure that the information will be passes on. So yeah, that's my comment about that, but yeah.
Now, I'd like to kind of ask you and also Michèle, well, Michaëlle, like I know that Michaëlle will be like the McCord Museum's next like artist in residence. And I'm wondering if the work that you're doing now with the community stories of the United Church, if that will be something that you'll bring into the project you'll be working with the McCord. And then for Michèle, I'm just curious about the work that you engaged in as the Photo Laureate, if that also kind of the activities you did were to amplify Black voices or BIPOC voices, I should say, and in the representation in, I guess, in Toronto itself, and if you work with archives in that way.
Michaëlle, you want to start, or?
Yeah, I wasn't sure. That's why I was looking at you. I can say a little something. I haven't worked yet at the museum, but the central idea that I have is to be able to make connections, because I think that's one thing that we do lack of, the connections between histories. And I feel like sometimes something would happen specifically in Little Burgundy in Montreal, but you know that it might be connected to another area in the same the same city. So that's one thing that I was really interested into, digging into the archives and seeing in the same year what was built in, like what group, what collective built into the same, in between the same years, and see the difference of either, how can I say it? Like the difference of discourses, the difference of narratives, if one collective or one community was really centering their preoccupation into one subject in, I don't know, 1907, and versus another community focusing on something else. So that's mostly the connections that I'm trying to make, that I will be trying to make when I'll start the residency. But it's this idea of seeing what was happening at the same time within the same years.
Yeah, in my role as Photo Laureate, the role is to be an advocate and an ambassador for photography and visual arts in the city. But the majority of my term was during the pandemic. So, you know, many of the things that we had planned to do, we weren't able to do. But I was really just interested, rather than making photographs and asking Torontonians to look at them, I was just really interested in focusing on the work that photographs do and thinking about ways to, you know, I'm so grateful for the image literacy that I have because of what I do. And I think that it's something that should be taught, you know, in primary school. I think image literacy is just such an important everyday skill. And so I just really wanted to spend the 3 years focused on, you know, offering a contribution in that direction. And so, you know, my major activity was writing a monthly column in the Toronto Star that considered issues of, you know, ethics and representation and power, the way that photography, the intersection between power and photography, and then a lot of mentorship. So a lot of supporting younger photographers through both formal and informal, you know, routes. And so it wasn't so much a reflection. I saw it as a civic role and a role of service, as opposed to a role that was investing in my individual practice. But it certainly deepened and strengthened my relationship to photography. Yeah.
Thanks. We've got a question from an anonymous attendee. Just want to say thank you all for an insightful discussion. As a first-generation Canadian, I find I can relate to much of your sharing. Sorry, it's not a question, it's a comment. Gratefully and respectfully yours. There. Are there any other questions or comments from our attendees and also from the panelists for each other? Because I think we have to wrap up in a few minutes.
I just want to express all of you, when I think of, you know, the artists who inform and the artists that I'm in conversation with, and you know, Charles, when you mentioned getting together intentionally, I wish that geography wasn't such a challenge, and I wish that we could all, you know, get together in person more often. So yeah, just expressing my gratitude for all of your practices.
And likewise, really wonderful to be able to begin with this really great group of folks. And thank you, Karen, for bringing us all together.
Thank you all. I'll just read one more comment. I think this is from Lisa. Well, it says Griffin Art Projects. I think it's from our director, Lisa. Thank you all for these thoughtful presentations and your beautiful work. I'm struck by how each of you use space and consider spatialization critically in your work, which parallels holding political space. I'm curious about what is next for each of you as you move forward in your practices and how creating these spaces within your work continues. Maybe Charles can start because you're hopping on a plane. Right.
Sure. I mean, I did mention a little bit the project that I'm working on, which is the Black Breath Archive project, and I would say, like, emphasize that at the moment is really much more about this is a practice of community formation for me. It's the collecting the archive is important, and it has this sort of visceral impact and weight to sort of spending this sort of intimate time listening to breath for me, but there's also an aspect of it where I'm actually getting to know a lot more of my community because I'm having to reach out to them to get to make these sort of interconnections with people, and that sort of yeah, it seems like looking at my practice as much less of a solo pursuit, and even when I kind of think about performance and so on, more thinking about it as a collective endeavor and around yeah, the formation of community is becoming more important.
What's next for you, Dawit?
Well, I mean, it's just, I would nicely sort of add to, to what you just said, Charles, is so increasingly there are these shifts in terms of how I'm working, collective work that I'm doing, which are becoming much more important. So working with, there's an artist activist that I'm working with in Berlin, Egypt. And that is changing the nature of what I'm attempting to as an artist, away from, as you've said, sort of less individual things and more collective oriented sort of projects. But I'm also finding a shift in terms of my, the exhibitions, so that the exhibitions used to be the culmination, but they've now become the starting point for the exhibition becoming a gathering site for various things, symposium, community conversations, publications, and texts. So I will continue to do that type of work. But this research is the work of a lifetime. I feel like I haven't even started. I really feel like I haven't started. The last thing that I will say is just again to reiterate what Michèle said. I want to thank everyone. It was wonderful to get to know more of your practices. Michèle, I know yours very well. But the one magic that I will add, if I can, about COVID has been, I think Zoom and these types of gatherings have made physical displacement less an impediment for getting together. So I would hope that we could find other mechanisms for doing so on similar platforms. Thank you, Karen.
Oh, thank you. There's one, I'll maybe end off with a comment from attendee Ileana. Super interesting and enlightening conversation. Thank you. So on that note, I'm going to just invite Fani back just to kind of wrap up. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your work and insights with us. And this, I just want to mention that on December 4th, we'll have our last event of the ReMIX history public programming. It's a film series where we're going to screen Welcome to Africville from Dana Inkster, Fire and Fury from Nadine Dassin, The Crying Conch by Vincent Toy, and Pouvoir de Paul Tom. So back to you, Fani.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to all the panelists for an incredible conversation. And thank you, the audience, for joining us here today for the second panel of our ReMIX History series. We hope to see you at our next event on November 20th at 1 p.m. PST for our curator in residence, Clelia Kuznets curator talk, which will follow with a Q&A. I'm just going to put the link on the chat. And yeah, also a reminder that our gallery, Griffin Art Projects, does have an exhibition, Stan Douglas, Allegories of the Present. We are open Friday through Sunday, noon to 5 p.m. You can find out more about Griffin and subscribe to our newsletter to know more about us right on the bottom of our website, which I'm also sharing on the chat. And yeah, thank you, everyone.